The dinner happened on a Thursday. It was the kind of dinner that Thursday dinners become when they start as something ordinary and end as something else. The kind where the food is good, and the wine is open, and the conversation is warm for the first hour, and then shifts, as conversations shift when the wine is working and the guards are down, into the territory where people say things they have been holding for a while. My daughter Caroline had made the chicken dish she learned from her mother, the one with the lemon and the rosemary, that fills the house with a smell that makes everything feel like it is supposed to. We were at the table in her dining room in the house she and Derek had bought in 2021, a house in the Buena Vista neighborhood of Charlotte that cost more than I thought Derek's income fully supported, though I had learned by then to keep that observation where it lived, which was in the quiet part of my mind, where I kept the things I had noted but not yet acted on. There were 4 of us, Caroline and Derek and their daughter Lily, who was 6 and who had been excused from the table after she ate and was now in the living room, with the specific focused energy of a child who has been given 30 minutes of tablet time and intends to use all 30. The 3 of us remained at the table with the wine and the candles. Derek had been talking about his company. He did this often, and I had developed a practiced attentiveness to it, the look and the posture of a man who is fully engaged with what he is hearing, which I had learned to produce independently of whether I was in fact learning anything new. Derek worked in operations management at a technology services firm in Charlotte, and he spoke about his work with the particular authority of a man who has had enough professional success to have stopped questioning whether his perspective on things was the correct one. He was talking about a reorganization, redundancies being cut, a new regional structure being implemented. He was describing it with the specific satisfaction of someone describing a thing they had been part of shaping, which was a satisfaction I recognized and respected, because I had spent 30 years being that person in those rooms, and I understood what it felt like to have built something and to see it run correctly. He said something about the quarter projections. He said something about the leadership team being sharper than it had been in 3 years. Then he poured the last of the wine into his glass, and he leaned back in his chair, and he looked at me across the table, with the expression he sometimes produced at dinner tables, which was the expression of a man who has been indulging a conversation and is now going to say what he actually thinks. He said, "You know, Lawrence, I think what you need to understand is that the business world has changed significantly since your time. What worked 30 years ago doesn't map onto what we're dealing with now. The complexity is just different." I said I imagined that was true of most fields. He said, "It's not something you can really understand from the outside. You have to be in it to get it." I said I supposed so. Caroline was looking at her plate. Derek said, "I was talking to Caroline the other day about the retirement account situation and the supplement we've been providing, and I just think—" He paused, and in the pause I watched him decide to say the next thing, which was a decision he made with the specific confidence of a man who has never had a reason to understand what the consequence of saying a particular thing might be. "I just think that we need to be realistic about the fact that at some point, having your father as a financial dependent isn't a sustainable arrangement for us. It's a real burden on my daughter." A burden on my daughter. I looked at Derek. I looked at Caroline. Caroline was still looking at her plate, which told me she had not known he was going to say this, or had known and had decided the right response was the plate. I said, "That's a fair thing to think about." I said it calmly. I said it the way I say most things, which is without the emotional charge that the words inside me were carrying, because I had spent 30 years in business, learning that the first thing you say, in response to the thing that surprises you, is almost never the right thing, and the second thing is usually better, and sometimes the best thing is to say the calm version of nothing, and let the other person sit inside what they have said, while you go away and decide what you are going to do about it. I drove home to Winston-Salem that evening. 2 hours on the interstate, with the radio off and the windows up, and the particular focused quiet of a man who has made a decision and is letting the edges of it sharpen. 3 days later, Derek Hollis walked into his Monday morning leadership briefing at Meridian Systems on South Boulevard in Charlotte. He walked into the main conference room on the 4th floor, and he stopped moving. I was sitting at the head of the table. He looked at me. Then he looked at the other people in the room, the faces he recognized from his years at the company. Then he looked at me again. I said, "Good morning, Derek. Close the door behind you. We're about to start. My name is Lawrence Greer. I am 69 years old. I live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And what my son-in-law did not know, in 36 months of sitting at my daughter's dinner table and commenting on my retirement and my relevance and my status as a financial weight his family was carrying, was that the company he had come to work for in the spring of 2021 was a company I had founded in 1991 and had built over 25 years from a spare bedroom on Silas Creek Parkway into one of the regional technology services firms that other firms eventually decide to acquire. He did not know who built the room he was standing in, and I had never told him. Welcome to True Story. Hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments below. We read every single one. Real quick before we get into it, and feel free to skip ahead if you just want the story, no pressure. But if you've ever watched one of these and thought, what if that happened to my family? I built something for exactly that. It's called Ironclad. It's how you protect your legacy, your paperwork, and your peace before anyone gets the chance to test it. Scan the QR code on screen or hit the first link in the description. It's half off today. Okay, now let's go back to the beginning. Greer Technical Solutions opened for business in March of 1991, which was a month when the first Gulf War was ending and the recession was doing what recessions do to small businesses that have not yet established enough momentum to be insulated from them. I was 35 years old and I had spent 11 years working for a technology consulting firm in Greensboro that had given me the professional education I needed and the specific frustration that tends to precede the decision to build something yourself. The frustration was specific, not about money, though money was part of it. It was about the gap between what I could see was possible and what the organization I was inside was willing to do about what was possible. I had a particular way of looking at client problems that the firm I worked for did not fully value, which was the way of looking at a system as a whole rather than as a collection of parts. And I kept arriving at solutions that required the client to think about the whole rather than asking the firm to fix a part. And that whole system orientation was not the business model the firm was running. I left in February of 1991. I started Greer Technical Solutions with a leased office space the size of a generous walk-in closet in the basement of a building on Silas Creek Parkway in Winston-Salem, a used computer, a telephone, and one client, a furniture manufacturer in High Point, who had hired me specifically because of the whole system orientation that my former employer had not known what to do with. The first 3 years were what the first 3 years of any honest business are, which is consistently difficult and occasionally terrifying and punctuated by enough evidence of actual progress to keep you from concluding that the difficulty and the terror are the permanent condition rather than the temporary one. I worked 70 hours a week for the first 3 years. My wife Eleanor, who was a dental hygienist, and whose income was the financial floor under everything during that period, did not complain about the hours or the uncertainty. She kept the house and raised our daughter and said, when I was most discouraged, exactly the right thing, which was not encouragement, but observation. She would say, Lawrence, you've been right about every client solution you've proposed for the past 11 years. There's no reason to conclude you've started being wrong. She was right. I had been right. The clients I brought on in 1992 and 1993 found that the whole system approach produced results that incremental part fixing had not produced, and they told other clients, and by 1996, Greer Technical Solutions had 14 employees and 300 square feet of actual office space on Peters Creek Parkway, and enough recurring contract revenue that Eleanor had been able to reduce her hours at the dental practice. By 2005, we had 61 employees. By 2010, we had 104. By 2015, the year before the first acquisition approach came in, Greer Technical Solutions was grossing $31 million annually, with 147 full-time employees and a client portfolio that covered most of the major industries represented in the Piedmont Triad and Charlotte metro areas. Eleanor died in 2014, ovarian cancer, diagnosed in June, and she was gone by November, which is the compressed timeline that disease produces, and that does not give a person enough room to accept what is coming before it arrives. I have already said what I need to say about that kind of loss in other contexts, and I will not repeat the full weight of it here. What I will say is that Eleanor was the person who made Greer Technical Solutions possible in every way that did not involve the client work, and that her absence was structural and not peripheral, and that what I did in 2016 with the company was connected to her absence in ways that I understood even at the time, and that I have understood more clearly in the years since. In March of 2016, a private equity group based in Atlanta approached me about acquiring Greer Technical Solutions. They were consolidating regional technology services firms into a national platform, and they wanted Greer as an anchor in the Carolinas market. The number they offered was a number that, in any honest accounting, represented the correct valuation for what I had built. And the timing was such that I had been running the company alone, without Eleanor, for 2 years, and I had begun to feel the specific fatigue that comes not from the work itself, but from the absence of the person who made the work feel like it was for something larger than the work. I negotiated the terms over 4 months. My attorney, Patricia Vance, who had been handling Greer Technical Solutions legal affairs since 2004, negotiated with me and produced an agreement that contained, among its standard provisions, one non-standard provision that I had insisted on and that the PE group had initially resisted before understanding that my insistence was structural and not negotiable. The provision gave me the right to return to the company in an executive chairman capacity for a period not to exceed 18 months, triggerable at my sole discretion, with 60 hours notice, during any transition period affecting the company's leadership. The provision would remain valid through any subsequent acquisition of the firm, transferring with the company's ownership, for a period of 10 years from the date of the original sale. Patricia had said, reviewing the final language, "Lawrence, I want to make sure you understand what you're building into this. This clause travels with the company regardless of who owns it. If this firm changes hands 3 times in 10 years, whoever owns it in year 9 still has to honor this." I said, "I know. That's exactly what I want." She had said, "Why?" I had said, "Because I built it, and I want to know it's still there if I need it." She had accepted that without further question. She was a good attorney. The acquisition closed in October of 2016. Greer Technical Solutions became Nexus Operations Solutions, rebranded by the PE Group as part of their platform consolidation. I received my payment. I retained a non-voting minority interest and my board advisory seat. I moved back into the house on Silas Creek Parkway, which Eleanor and I had lived in for 23 years, and I retired. In 2019, Nexus Operations Solutions was acquired by a larger national group and rebranded again as Meridian Systems. My advisory seat transferred per the agreement Patricia had built. My provision transferred. The new owners, a management team operating out of Boston, had reviewed the agreement as part of due diligence and had noted the provision in their risk documentation as a legacy contractual obligation of negligible likely relevance. I was aware of this characterization. I had been informed of it by Patricia, who was still my attorney, and who had reviewed the second acquisition documentation on my behalf. I had noted their characterization of the provision and filed it in the quiet part of my mind where I kept such things. Derek Hollis joined Meridian Systems in April of 2021, recruited through a Charlotte-based professional services recruiter for an operations management position in the Southeast Regional Division. He had a background in supply chain operations and a competence in process management that the hiring team had found sufficient for the role. He had been my son-in-law since September of 2019, which predated his joining the company by 18 months. He did not know he worked for a company I founded. He had no reason to research Meridian Systems' founding history. The company had been through 2 rebrands and 2 acquisitions. The Greer name had not survived the first rebrand. A person joining in 2021 looking at the company's history would find Nexus Operations Solutions as the predecessor and Greer Technical Solutions as a further removed predecessor mentioned in a single paragraph of a corporate history document that lived on a page of the company intranet that the operations team had no functional reason to visit. He simply did not know. I had known he worked there. He had told me, when he got the job, that he had joined a technology services firm in Charlotte, and I had asked the name, and he had said Meridian Systems, and I had noted it, and said that sounded like an interesting opportunity. I had not told him what I knew. I had not told Caroline either, not because I was planning anything, not yet, because there was no reason to tell someone a thing that required a context they had not created yet. The context arrived on a Thursday dinner in the Buena Vista neighborhood, when my son-in-law looked at me across the table and described me as a burden on my daughter. I drove home to Winston-Salem with the radio off. I sat in the driveway for a while. Then I went inside, and I called Patricia Vance. Patricia answered on the third ring. She had been my attorney for 20 years, and she had a quality I valued in a professional, which was that she did not perform surprise. She received information, and she processed it, and she responded with what was useful, rather than with what was dramatic. I told her about the dinner. I told her about what Derek had said. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Are you calling me about the provision?" I said, "I'm calling to ask whether the provision is still operative." She said, "It is." I reviewed the second acquisition documentation myself. The provision transferred intact. You have the right to return as executive chairman, 60 hours notice, triggerable through December of 2026. I said, "And the current leadership situation?" She said, "That's an interesting question to ask right now." She told me. The current CEO of Meridian Systems, a man named Paul Garrett, who had been installed by the Boston Management Group in 2020, had announced his departure the previous week. The board was in a search process. The company was in a leadership transition period that, per the provision's language, was precisely the kind of period that triggered my return right. She said, "Lawrence, if you trigger this, you understand the optics." I said, "Tell me what you mean." She said, "Your son-in-law works there. You would be his employer's executive chairman within 72 hours of a dinner where he said something that upset you. The connection is going to be visible to anyone who looks at the timeline." I said, "I know." She said, "And?" I said, "Patricia, I built that company for 25 years. Paul Garrett leaving creates a transition period that triggers my legal right to return. The provision exists because I insisted on it when I didn't have a reason to use it, because I had the instinct that someday I would. The timeline is what it is. The right is what it is. Those two things are true at the same time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll draft the notice tonight. You'll need to review and execute by Saturday for the 60 hours to put you in Monday." I said, "Send it over in the morning." I reviewed it Friday morning. I signed it Friday afternoon. Patricia transmitted it to the Meridian Systems board chair Friday at 4:17. By Saturday morning, I had a response confirming receipt and acknowledging the triggered provision and informing me that the board would accommodate my return effective Monday with a briefing call Sunday evening. I called James Whitfield on Saturday. James had been my chief operating officer at Greer Technical Solutions from 2008 until the first acquisition, and had stayed on through both rebrands, now serving as chief financial officer at Meridian. He was 63 years old, had known me for 22 years, and had the quality that I had always most valued in a professional partner, which was that he understood the difference between what needed to be said and what was merely available to be said, and he applied that distinction consistently. He picked up and said, "I was wondering when you were going to call." I said, "You knew about the provision?" He said, "I've always known about the provision. I was in the room when Patricia negotiated it. And Lawrence, I want to say something before you say anything else. The people here are going to be glad to have you back. Paul leaving created a real instability, and the board has been in 3 emergency sessions since the announcement. Whatever your personal reasons for triggering this now, the business reason is valid, and I don't want you to feel like you're doing something you need to explain." I said, "I might need to explain one piece of it." He said, "Derek Hollis." I said, "You know him?" He said, I've sat in a number of meetings with him. He's competent in operations. He also has a certain way of presenting himself in rooms that I've noticed, which is that he presents himself as though the room has been waiting for his contribution. Some people grow out of that. Some don't, I said. He called me a burden on my daughter Thursday evening. James was quiet for a moment. Then, I assume you'd like him in the Monday morning leadership briefing. I said, I'd like him in the Monday morning leadership briefing. James said, I'll make sure he's on the list. The Sunday evening briefing call with the Meridian board chair, a man named Frederick Cole, who had been appointed by the Boston Management Group and who was careful and professional in all his dealings, lasted 45 minutes. Frederick walked me through the current state of the business, the key operational issues, the leadership gaps Paul's departure had created, and the board's priorities for the transition period. I listened and asked questions, and by the end of the call, Frederick said, Lawrence, I want to say that the board is relieved. Whatever the circumstances that led you to trigger the provision now, the timing is actually quite good for the company. I said I was glad the timing worked. I said I would see the team Monday morning. I arrived at the South Boulevard office at 7:15. The Meridian Systems headquarters occupied floors 3 through 6 of a modern commercial building in Charlotte's South End district, which was a long way from the basement office on Silas Creek Parkway, and was also, in every meaningful way, a direct line from it. Everything in the building, the systems architecture, the client relationship methodology, the operational framework that had been adapted and rebranded but not fundamentally altered through 2 acquisitions, traced back to the approach I had developed in that basement office in 1991. James met me in the lobby. He had coffee. He walked me to the 4th floor conference room and gave me 30 minutes of the specific operational briefing that only a 22-year colleague, who also happens to be the current CFO, can provide, which is not the briefing that comes from documents, but the briefing that comes from someone who knows where the actual bodies are buried and considers it his professional responsibility to make sure you know too. At 7:55, he said, the leadership team starts arriving at 8. The briefing is scheduled for 8:15. I said, who's on the list? He named 11 people. Derek Hollis was the 8th name. I said, good. I sat at the head of the conference table. The room filled. Department heads, regional directors, the senior operations team. Each of them came in and found me at the head of the table and produced some version of the response that people produce when they walk into a room and find it different from what they expected, ranging from a visible double take to a careful professional neutrality to, in 2 cases, a genuine warmth from people who had been at Nexus Operations when I had still been involved in an advisory capacity and recognized me from that period. Derek walked in at 8:11. He came through the door in the specific way he moved through rooms, with the settled confidence of a man who has decided he belongs wherever he goes. He was looking at his phone as he came in, which is the thing people do when they want to appear occupied rather than arriving. He looked up from the phone and his eyes moved to the head of the table and he stopped moving. The stop was complete, not a hesitation, a full stop, the specific physical event of a person's body receiving information that their brain has not yet finished processing. He looked at me. I looked at him. I said, "Good morning, Derek. Close the door behind you. We're about to start." He closed the door. He found a chair. He sat down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who is managing his physical presentation, because his internal presentation is currently not available to be managed. He set his phone face down on the table, which is not something he would have done when he walked in. I let the room settle. I looked around the table at 11 people who were about to understand what the next several weeks were going to look like, and I said, "For those who don't know me, my name is Lawrence Greer. I founded this company in 1991 under the name Greer Technical Solutions. I sold it in 2016 with a contractual provision giving me the right to return as executive chairman during leadership transition periods, and with Paul Garrett's departure last week, I've triggered that provision, effective today. I'll be in this role for the duration of the transition, which the board expects to run between 6 and 12 months. I looked around the room again. Most faces had the attentive professional expression of people absorbing significant information and choosing to reserve their reaction until they had more context. Two people had expressions that suggested they found this development genuinely reassuring. James Whitfield, at the far end of the table, was looking at his coffee. Derek Hollis was looking at the table. I said, "I want to be clear about one thing before we get into the operational briefing. This company was built on a specific way of looking at problems, which is as whole systems rather than as collections of parts. That's what made the clients stay through 2 rebrands and 2 ownership changes. That's what makes this business worth the structure it has. We're going to be returning to that orientation over the next several months, and I'm going to need every person in this room to be thinking about the full picture rather than just the piece they're responsible for." I looked at Derek when I said the last sentence. Not obviously, just in the natural sweep of the room that a person at the head of a table makes when they are speaking to the whole table. But I looked at him. He did not look back. The briefing ran 90 minutes. It was productive and specific and covered what it needed to cover, and by the end of it, the 11 people in the room had a clear sense of what the transition period was going to look like and what I expected from each of them. They filed out with the purposeful energy of a team that has been given direction after a period of uncertainty. Derek was the last to leave. He stood up and he gathered his materials with the careful movements of a man who has been sitting in a specific experience for 90 minutes and has not yet decided what to do with it. He started toward the door. I said, "Derek, stay a moment." He stopped. The last 2 people ahead of him went through the door, and it closed behind them, and we were alone in the conference room, on the 4th floor of the building, on South Boulevard, that I had paid for the rights to this moment, in 1991, without knowing it. He turned around. He stood with his materials against his chest, the way people hold things when they need something to hold. I said, "Sit down." He sat. I said, "I'm going to say one thing, and I'm going to say it once, and then it's going to be filed where it belongs, and we're going to run this company through its transition. Can you hear one thing?" He said yes. I said, "I never told you who built this place, because there was no reason to tell you. That was not a calculation. It was simply that the information had not become relevant. It became relevant Thursday evening. I want you to know that what I did Monday morning was not a response to Thursday evening. I triggered the provision because Paul Garrett left, and because I have a legal right to return during transition periods, and because the business needs steady leadership right now. Those are the business reasons, and they are sufficient, and they are the only reasons I intend to discuss with anyone who asks." I paused. I said, "But I also want you to know that I heard what you said Thursday. About Caroline. About the supplement. About what you called the burden of having me in your family's financial picture." He said, "Lawrence," I said, "I'm not angry. I want to be precise about that because it matters. Anger would be the wrong thing to feel about what you said, and it would produce the wrong response to it. What I feel is clearer than anger. What I feel is the specific clarity of a man who has been underestimated by someone in his own family, and who understands that the underestimation was possible because he had been quiet about what he was." He was looking at the table. I said, "I have been quiet about what I am for a long time. I was quiet about it when Eleanor was alive because it was not who we were. We built the business because it was the right work, not because we needed the business to define us. I was quiet about it after Eleanor died, because the business had been sold, and the quiet felt correct for a man who had set something down. And I was quiet about it when you came into Caroline's life, because my daughter's marriage was not something I needed to hold over anyone. I said, "You called me a burden. I want you to understand who said that about whom." Derek looked up. His face had gone through several things during the time I had been talking, and had arrived at something that was not fully formed, but that contained, in its incompleteness, the beginning of an honest accounting. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't know. That's the point." He said, "Why didn't Caroline tell me?" I said, "Because Caroline doesn't lead with what I built. She leads with who she is. She got that from her mother." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "What happens now?" I said, "What happens now is that you do your job well. You know operations. James tells me you have a good read on the Southeast regional accounts. The transition is going to need that. What happens now is that you do the work, and I do the work, and we both understand something about each other that we didn't understand before Thursday. He said, "And at home?" I said, "At home you're my daughter's husband and Lily's father. That doesn't change. The dinner table doesn't change. What changes is the information you're working with." He stood up. He extended his hand. I looked at the hand for a moment, and then I shook it. He left. I sat in the conference room on the 4th floor for a while after he left, in the specific quiet of a room that has held something significant and is settling back into its ordinary function. The Charlotte skyline was visible through the window on the south wall, which was not a view I had designed or chosen, but which had come with the building that the business had grown into. James knocked on the open door at 11:15 and said, "How'd the private session go?" I said, "The way it needed to go." James said, "You know the team is going to talk about this." I said, "Let them talk. The business reason is legitimate and documented, and the board confirmed it. Whatever people make of the timing is something I'll manage when it needs managing." He said, "Patricia's going to want a call this afternoon." I said, "I know. Tell her noon." He smiled and left. I turned to the window and the Charlotte skyline, and I thought about the basement office on Silas Creek Parkway, and the furniture manufacturer in High Point, who had been the first client, and the 70-hour weeks in 1991 and 1992 and 1993, and Eleanor saying, "There's no reason to conclude you've started being wrong." I had not started being wrong. I had built something that had lasted 32 years, through 2 owners, and 2 rebrands, and 1 dinner on a Thursday in Buena Vista, where a man who did not know what he was sitting across from had said what he said. The building was still there. The work was still there. The provision had traveled with it exactly as I had written it. I had known, when I insisted on that clause in 2016, that someday the reason for it would make itself clear. I had not known what the reason would be. I had simply trusted, as I had always trusted, that a man who builds something correctly does not need to know in advance every situation the structure will be called upon to hold. The structure held. Patricia called at noon. We talked for 20 minutes about the transition timeline and the board's expectations, and 2 operational matters she wanted me to be aware of before the first full board session. At the end of the call, she said, "Lawrence, I've been your attorney for 20 years. Can I say something that is not legal counsel?" I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Eleanor would have loved this. Not the business part. The part where you sat in that room Monday morning and the door opened." I looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline. I said, "I know she would have." Caroline called Tuesday evening. She said she had spoken to Derek. She said he had told her what he didn't know, and what he had figured out on Monday, and she said she needed a moment to sit with what she was feeling about both of those things. She said she was not angry at me. She said she was not exactly not angry at Derek. She said she was going to need some time. I said, "Take the time you need. The dinner table is still the dinner table." She said, "He told me what you said in the room after the meeting." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part about me. That I don't lead with what you built. That I lead with who I am." I said, "That's the truth." She said, "I got that from Mom, didn't I?" I said, "Yes, you did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I miss her, Dad." I said, "I know. So do I." We talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with the company, or Derek, or Monday morning, and by the end of the call, the specific warmth that is particular to a father and daughter who have known each other for 38 years was back in the conversation where it belongs. Lily asked Caroline the next morning, in the way that 6-year-olds ask things, why Grandpa was on TV. Caroline showed her the local business news segment that had run Monday evening about Meridian Systems' leadership transition. Lily watched it carefully. At the end, she said, "Grandpa looks important." Caroline said, "He is, baby." Lily said, "Does Daddy know?" Caroline said he was finding out. I kept the hours at Meridian that the transition required, which in the first month were significant, and in the second month were more manageable, as the team found its rhythm under the new structure. Derek performed his job well. James had been right that he had a good read on the Southeast accounts, and I had been right that the whole system orientation was something that could be built into the operations team if the person leading it understood the direction they were being asked to move in. He came to understand the direction. That took some time and some specific conversations with James, and one Friday afternoon session with me that covered the methodology at a level of detail that required Derek to set aside what he thought he already knew and hear it as though for the first time. He was a capable man. He was capable enough to understand, when the methodology was explained at full depth by the person who had developed it, that he had been working with a partial version of it. By the third month, we had reached a working relationship that was professional and specific, and built on the correct foundation, which was that we both knew what we knew about each other, and had decided to work from that knowledge rather than around it. The dinner table at Caroline's house on Buena Vista remains what it has always been: the chicken with the lemon and the rosemary, the candles, Lily excused after she eats, the wine. Derek pours carefully now. He asks about the business with genuine interest, rather than the interest that is a form of not asking. He listens when I talk, which is different from the listening that is a form of waiting for his turn. Small differences, the kind that accumulate into something larger than each of them individually. I have not brought up the Thursday dinner. It is not necessary to bring it up. The Monday morning meeting was the response to the Thursday dinner, and it said what it needed to say. And what has happened since has been built on what was said without requiring it to be repeated. A structure does its job by standing. You do not have to keep explaining it. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you are not already here, and I will see you in the next one. One more thing before you go, and again, skip this if you want, but if this story hit close to home, don't wait for your own version of it. Ironclad is $8.99 today, 50% off. It's the system for protecting your legacy, your documents, and your family before someone decides to test what you've built. Link and QR code are both on screen right now. Get your family's paperwork locked down tonight. True Story uploads every week. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one.